Xavier Zane stepped into the cafe just as the sky split open, unleashing a torrential downpour. He barely had time to shake the water from his designer coat before the door swung shut behind him, muffling the chaotic sounds of the storm outside. He had been on his way to an important meeting, but the city's unpredictable weather had other plans. With a sigh, he ran a hand through his damp, dark hair, scanning the cozy interior for a place to sit. The cafe was small but inviting, filled with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. A few patrons sat scattered around, either typing away on laptops or chatting quietly. His sharp gaze landed on an empty table near the window, but before he could move, his attention was drawn to a woman behind the counter. She wasn't like the women he was used to, polished socialites with designer handbags and rehearsed smiles. There was something refreshingly real about her. Her chestnut brown hair was tied in a loose ponytail, and her emerald green eyes sparkled with quiet determination as she moved swiftly, balancing plates and taking orders with effortless grace. "Can I help you?" Her voice was soft but confident, pulling him from his thoughts. Xavier blinked, realizing he had been staring. It wasn't like him to get distracted. "Coffee, black." The woman arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his curt tone. "We have different blends." "Any preference?" "Something strong." He pulled out his phone, intending to check his emails, but the weak signal had other plans. Frustrated, he slipped the device back into his coat pocket. She nodded, turning to prepare his drink. He watched as she poured the steaming liquid with practiced ease, her movements precise yet unhurried. When she placed the cup in front of him, he reached for it, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. A jolt of something unfamiliar shot through him, an odd warmth settling in his chest. "Thanks," he said, his voice lower than before. She offered him a small smile but didn't engage further, returning to her work as though he were just another customer. The realization unsettled him. He was Xavier Zane, CEO of Zane Enterprises, a man whose presence commanded attention the moment he entered a room. And yet, she hadn't given him a second glance. He took a sip of the coffee and nearly groaned. It was perfect, rich, bold, and exactly what he needed. He glanced at her name tag. Cassidy Nolan. Cassidy, he tested the name on his tongue. She looked up from the register, her brows slightly raised. "Yes. This coffee is good." He rarely offered compliments, but something about her made him want to. She chuckled, wiping her hands on a towel. "Glad you approve, mister." "Xavier," he said, watching her reaction. She nodded, not recognizing his name. That was new. "Well, Xavier, enjoy your coffee." With that, she turned to another customer, leaving him staring after her. The storm raged on outside, but for the first time in a long while, Xavier wasn't in a rush to leave. Xavier had every intention of finishing his coffee and leaving. He had a full schedule, a dozen pressing matters demanding his attention, and yet he didn't move. His fingers drummed against the ceramic mug as he watched Cassidy move behind the counter, seamlessly handling customers with a quiet efficiency that intrigued him. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter, as if she'd been doing this her entire life. There was something about that confidence, unassuming but firm, that made it impossible to look away. A sudden crash broke through the low hum of chatter. A tray of dishes had hit the floor near the kitchen entrance, and Xavier's gaze snapped toward the source of the noise. Cassidy was already moving, crouching down to help the younger barista who had dropped them. "Don't worry about it, Mia," she said, her voice calm despite the flustered look on the girl's face. "Just grab the broom. I'll take care of the rest." Mia, a teenager with wide eyes and shaking hands, scrambled to do as she was told. Cassidy, meanwhile, scooped up broken ceramic pieces without hesitation, her brow furrowed in concentration. Xavier found himself watching her, noting the way she didn't snap or sigh in frustration. She simply handled it, the same way she seemed to handle everything else in this small cafe. It wasn't often that he took an interest in people, especially strangers, but something about her made him want to know more. Before he could stop himself, he stood and crossed the room. "You should be careful," he said, nodding toward the shattered pieces she was gathering. "You'll cut yourself." Cassidy glanced up at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes before amusement took its place. "You offering to help?" Xavier crouched beside her, reaching for a jagged shard. "I don't make a habit of cleaning up messes, but I suppose I can make an exception." Her lips twitched, though she didn't outright smile. "I'll try not to take that personally." He handed her the piece he'd picked up, watching as she placed it in the small bin she'd pulled closer. "Is this your place?" Cassidy shook her head. "No, I just run things when the owner's not around." "Sounds like you do more than that." She shot him a look, one he couldn't quite decipher. "Someone has to keep things from falling apart." Xavier studied her, noting the way exhaustion lingered in the corners of her eyes despite the energy she exuded. He knew that look. It was the same one he saw in the mirror on nights when work consumed him entirely. Mia returned with the broom, and Cassidy stood, dusting off her hands before taking it from her. "I've got it from here, Mia. Just focus on the front." The girl hesitated for half a second before nodding and hurrying back to the counter. Xavier remained where he was, watching as Cassidy swept up the remaining fragments without complaint. "You always this hands-on?" he asked. She paused, leaning on the broom handle as she met his gaze. "You always this nosy?" Xavier chuckled, a rare sound that surprised even himself. "I prefer the term curious." Cassidy shook her head, finishing up quickly before disposing of the last bits of broken dishware. When she finally turned back to him, her expression was unreadable. "You don't seem like the type who lingers," she said. "So what's keeping you here?" It was a fair question. He had no reason to stay. And yet, the thought of walking out that door, stepping back into the world of boardrooms and negotiations, suddenly felt far less important than it had an hour ago. Instead of answering, he glanced toward the window. The rain showed no sign of letting up. "Looks like I'm stuck here a little longer." Cassidy followed his gaze, then crossed her arms. "Convenient." Xavier met her eyes, a challenge in his own. "Perhaps." She studied him for a long moment before shaking her head with a quiet laugh. "Well, if you're going to take up space, you might as well make yourself useful." He arched a brow. "And how exactly would you propose I do that?" Cassidy motioned toward the counter. "You look like someone who's always in control. Let's see how you do when you're the one taking orders for a change." Xavier stared at her. "You want me to work here?" "Just for a little while," she said, smirking. "Unless you'd rather sit there and sulk about the rain." He didn't sulk. And he certainly didn't take orders from anyone. But damn if he wasn't tempted to see just how far she was willing to push him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself considering something purely for the fun of it. And that was dangerous. Xavier rolled up the sleeves of his tailored shirt. The stark contrast between the pristine fabric and the worn apron Cassidy tossed him almost comical. "Almost. You expect me to just take orders?" He examined the laminated menu she placed in front of him as though it were a foreign artifact. Cassidy leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "It's not that complicated. People tell you what they want and you get it for them. You've done that before, right?" His gaze flicked up. "I usually prefer to be the one giving orders." "That's kind of obvious," she said, barely suppressing a grin. "But humor me, who knows? Maybe you'll learn something." Xavier wasn't sure what exactly he was supposed to learn from playing barista for an afternoon, but something about the way she looked at him challenging, completely unimpressed by his status, made it impossible to refuse. A middle-aged woman approached the counter, glancing at him expectantly. What can I get for you?" The words felt unnatural coming from him. "A caramel latte, extra foam, and a blueberry scone," the woman ordered. Xavier turned slightly toward Cassidy, lowering his voice. "What's a caramel latte?" Cassidy exhaled, shaking her head. "You own half this city and you've never ordered anything but black coffee." "I don't see the point of drowning espresso in sugar," he muttered. "Well, some of us like a little sweetness in our lives," she shot back before nudging him aside and demonstrating how to use the espresso machine. You steam the milk, add the espresso, drizzle the caramel, simple. Xavier followed her instructions, albeit stiffly. He wasn't accustomed to this kind of work, but he wasn't about to let her see him fail. Within a few minutes, the latte was done, looking somewhat presentable. Cassidy passed the scone to the customer, who took her order with a polite nod before walking off. Not bad, Cassidy admitted. Xavier arched an eyebrow. You sound surprised. I am, she admitted, slapping an order slip on the counter. Let's see if you can keep up. The next 20 minutes were a chaotic rush of orders, spilled milk, and more than one confused glance from customers who clearly weren't expecting a man in an expensive watch to fumble over a cappuccino machine. Yet, despite the unfamiliarity, Xavier found himself strangely enjoying it. There was something grounding about the work, something different from the endless boardrooms and transactions that dictated his life. Cassidy slid a tall iced coffee toward a customer before turning to him. You're not bad at this, you know. He wiped his hands on a towel, glancing at her. I don't think my shareholders would be thrilled to see me making lattes for a living. She tilted her head. Maybe, but I bet none of them have ever seen you actually enjoy what you're doing. Xavier faltered at that. Enjoyment wasn't usually part of the equation for him. Success, control, power, those were the things that dictated his choices. But she wasn't wrong. There was something oddly satisfying about this, about stepping out of his meticulously curated world and into hers. Before he could respond, the cafe's front door opened abruptly. A man in his mid-40s strode in, his gaze sweeping across the cafe before landing on Cassidy. His expression was tight, disapproving. Cassidy's easy demeanor shifted in an instant. What are you doing here, Mark? Her voice had lost its warmth. Mark ignored her question, his focus narrowing on Xavier. And who's this? Xavier straightened, his instincts immediately sharpening. He didn't like the way Mark looked at her, like she was an inconvenience rather than a person. Cassidy's shoulders tensed. He's a customer, Mark scoffed. He's behind the counter. Xavier set down the cloth in his hands, stepping forward slightly. Is there a problem? Mark ignored him, directing his attention back to Cassidy. You were supposed to call me. I've been busy, she replied flatly. Too busy to deal with the fact that the cafe is behind on payments. Xavier's jaw tightened at the shift in conversation. Cassidy exhaled sharply. I told you I'm handling it. Mark shook his head, rubbing his temple. Handling it? Cassidy, you're drowning. This place can't survive on stubbornness alone. Xavier's gaze flicked between them, piecing things together. Mark wasn't just some concerned acquaintance. He was someone with power over this cafe, perhaps a lender or worse, a landlord. Cassidy's voice remained even. I'll figure it out. Mark didn't look convinced. You've got until the end of the month. And with that, he turned on his heel and walked out, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Xavier studied her carefully. You're in trouble. Cassidy's fingers curled around the edge of the counter. I don't need your pity. Pity, he scoffed. I don't do pity, but I do recognize when someone is barely keeping their head above water. She exhaled, her frustration barely masked. It's not your problem. Maybe not, he admitted, but that doesn't mean I'm walking away. Her green eyes met his, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was something vulnerable in them. Xavier wasn't sure what it was about this cafe, about this woman, but one thing was clear: he wasn't done here. Not yet. Xavier didn't walk away. He wasn't the type to ignore a problem, especially not when it involved something or someone who had unexpectedly gripped his attention. And Cassidy had done just that. The cafe had quieted after the tense exchange with Mark, but the weight of his words lingered in the air. Cassidy busied herself wiping down the counter, but Xavier could see the strain in her posture, the way her fingers pressed a little too hard against the cloth. You're not fine, he said plainly. Cassidy didn't look up. I didn't say I was. Then why are you pretending? She exhaled, setting the cloth down and finally meeting his gaze. Because what else am I supposed to do, Xavier? This place is everything to me. I can't just let it slip through my fingers. Xavier studied her carefully. There was no desperation in her voice, no pleading, just determination. And that was what made her different from everyone else in his world. She wasn't looking for a handout, she wasn't waiting for someone to save her. She was fighting even when the odds were stacked against her, but she didn't have to fight alone. What if I helped? Cassidy's brows pulled together. Helped? I have resources, connections. A dry laugh escaped her lips. You want to buy my problems away? Xavier shook his head. No. I want to give you options. Cassidy leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. And why would you do that? He didn't have an answer that made sense. He wasn't the kind of man who did things without a clear motive. Every decision he made was calculated, every risk measured, but this was something else entirely. Because I can, he said simply. Cassidy searched his face as if trying to find the catch. I don't need a billionaire swooping in to fix things for me. Xavier tilted his head slightly. Are you always this stubborn? She huffed. Are you always this persistent? His lips twitched. When something matters, yes. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. This cafe isn't just a business to me, it's my family's legacy. I have to be the one to save it. Xavier didn't argue. He understood the weight of responsibility better than most, but he also knew that sometimes survival meant knowing when to accept help. Then let me make a deal with you, he offered. Cassidy narrowed her eyes. What kind of deal? You don't take my money, not directly at least. But you let me invest, she frowned. Invest. In the cafe as a silent partner. She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. You want to own a coffee shop now, Xavier shrugged. I want to see what you do with it when you're not drowning in financial stress. Cassidy hesitated. And what do you get out of this? He leaned in slightly, holding her gaze. I get to see you win. Something shifted in her expression, something softer. That's it? That's it. Cassidy looked at him for a long moment as if trying to decide whether to trust him. He didn't blame her. People in her world weren't used to men like him offering something without expecting full control in return. Finally, she exhaled. If I say yes, you don't interfere. No corporate takeovers, no changes without my approval. Xavier nodded. Agreed. She considered him for another second before a slow smile found its way onto her lips. Then, deal, he extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation she slid her palm against his. The contact sent a faint jolt through him, something warm and unfamiliar. Cassidy pulled away quickly, clearing her throat. So, what now? Now, Xavier glanced at the rain still falling outside. Now, I think you owe me a proper cup of coffee for all my hard work behind this counter. Cassidy laughed, the tension finally breaking. Fine, but this time, you're not making it yourself. He watched her move behind the espresso machine, a feeling settling in his chest that he wasn't entirely ready to name. But one thing was certain. He had come in to escape the rain. He hadn't expected to find something worth staying for. Xavier wasn't used to waiting. He was a man who made things happen, who dictated the flow of his world with precision and control. Yet, as the days passed after striking his deal with Cassidy, he found himself lingering in anticipation. Not for business reports or boardroom decisions, but for the next time he'd step into that cafe and see her. His presence there became routine, though he never announced himself. He simply showed up, took a seat, and watched as Cassidy ran the cafe with her usual quiet determination. He noted the way she handled customers with ease, the way she fixed small problems before they could become big ones. And when she wasn't looking, he found himself memorizing the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, or how her lips pressed together in focus when counting the register. He wasn't supposed to be this invested. One afternoon, he arrived to find her deep in conversation with a man he didn't recognize. The stranger leaned against the counter, speaking in hushed tones, his expression tight. Xavier's instincts sharpened. Cassidy's posture was tense, though her voice remained steady. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't casual. The man gestured toward the back of the cafe as if urging her to step away from customers. She hesitated before nodding, disappearing into the kitchen with him. Xavier's jaw tightened. Minutes passed, then more. He drummed his fingers against his knee, irritation sparking in his chest. He had no claim over Cassidy, no right to question who she spoke to. And yet, something about the exchange unsettled him. When she finally reappeared, her expression was unreadable. She returned to the counter, her movements precise but lacking their usual ease. He rose from his seat, crossing the space between them. Who was that? His voice was even, but the underlying edge was impossible to miss. Cassidy looked up, startled, as if she hadn't noticed him there. Then her gaze narrowed. "You don't get to ask me that." His jaw flexed. "I don't like seeing you cornered," she exhaled, rubbing a hand over her forehead. "It's nothing, just complicated." Xavier wasn't a man who accepted vague answers. "Cassidy," she hesitated, then met his gaze. "My brother." That was unexpected. He studied her carefully. And he's not exactly reliable," she admitted. "He needed money." Xavier's expression darkened. "Did you give it to him?" Cassidy shook her head. "I don't have any to spare, and even if I did, it wouldn't help him." He'd just come back for more. Xavier understood people like that. Users. People who took and took, never satisfied, never considering the damage they left behind. He glanced toward the door where the man had exited. "Is he a threat?" Cassidy hesitated, then shook her head. "Not to me." Just to himself. Xavier didn't press further, though he made a mental note to quietly have someone look into her brother's situation. He wouldn't interfere unless necessary, but if Cassidy was at risk in any way, he wasn't going to stand by and watch. She sighed, leaning against the counter. "I don't want to talk about him," Xavier nodded. "Then don't." A small, grateful smile flickered across her lips. She exhaled, shaking off the tension. "You're here earlier than usual," he shrugged. "I had a meeting nearby." Cassidy arched a brow. "And yet here you are." Xavier didn't bother denying it. She studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "You know, you're not exactly what I expected." He tilted his head. "And what did you expect?" "A businessman with a god complex," she admitted. "Someone who throws money around and expects the world to cater to him." Xavier huffed a quiet laugh. "You're not entirely wrong," Cassidy smiled. "No, but there's more to you than that." Something shifted between them then, an unspoken understanding. Before he could respond, the bell above the door chimed, signaling another customer. Cassidy straightened. "Looks like duty calls." Xavier stepped back, watching as she returned to work. But as he sat down, something settled in his chest. This cafe had been an escape from the rain. Now, it was something far more dangerous. It was the one place he wanted to stay. Xavier had never been one to hesitate. His entire life had been built on decisive action, on seeing an opportunity and seizing it before anyone else could. Yet, when it came to Cassidy, he found himself treading carefully, something entirely unfamiliar to him. The cafe had become part of his daily life, a place where he wasn't Xavier Zane, the CEO, but just a man who enjoyed watching a woman who captivated him in ways he couldn't explain. He didn't push, didn't demand, but he was always there, and Cassidy never asked him to leave. But tonight was different. The cafe had closed hours ago, the last customer long gone, and yet he remained, leaning against the counter as Cassidy wiped down the tables. The warm glow of the overhead lights cast soft shadows across the space, making it feel smaller, more intimate. She glanced at him, amusement flickering in her eyes. "You know, most people go home when a place closes." Xavier tilted his head slightly. "Maybe I'm not most people." Cassidy tossed the cloth over her shoulder, crossing her arms. "Clearly." A beat of silence stretched between them, comfortable yet weighted. Xavier exhaled, pushing away from the counter. "I have something for you." Cassidy's brows lifted. "Should I be worried?" Instead of answering, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a single piece of paper, sliding it onto the counter. She eyed it warily before picking it up. As her eyes scanned the text, her expression shifted, surprise flickering across her face. "This is a deed," she said slowly. "To the cafe." Xavier nodded. "It belongs to you now, no debts, no negotiations, just yours." Cassidy stared at the document as if it might vanish at any moment. "How?" "I made some calls," he said simply. Mark was more than willing to let go of the property for the right price. Her gaze snapped to his, something unreadable swirling in her emerald eyes. "You bought it?" "Yes." Her fingers curled around the paper, tension creeping into her voice. "Xavier, I told you I didn't want a handout." "This isn't a handout," he said, his tone calm but firm. "This is me making sure you have what you need to succeed. You built this place. You kept it running even when everything was against you. Now you don't have to fight anymore." Cassidy set the paper down, frustration flickering across her face. "And what do you get out of this?" Xavier stepped closer, his voice quieter but no less intense. "You." She inhaled sharply, but he wasn't finished. "I don't make investments unless I believe in them," he continued. "And Cassidy, I believe in you, in this cafe, in everything you're capable of. I don't want to own it, I want you to have it without anyone holding power over you." Her lips parted, but no words came. Xavier reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against hers. "You once told me you didn't need a billionaire swooping in to fix things for you, and you were right. You didn't need me, but I wanted to do this. Because I care about you." Cassidy swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the document. "You're impossible." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "So I've been told," she exhaled, shaking her head, but there was no anger in her gaze, only something softer, something raw. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," he murmured. "Just let yourself have this." A moment of silence passed before she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her hands pressed against his chest, her touch uncertain at first, then steady. "Thank you," she whispered. Xavier's fingers slid under her chin, tilting her face up to meet his. "You don't have to thank me." She searched his gaze, and then, before he could say anything else, she rose onto her toes and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, but when Xavier pulled her closer, the hesitation melted away. She tasted like coffee and something sweeter, something uniquely her. He deepened the kiss, his hands settling on her waist, anchoring them both in the moment. When they finally broke apart, Cassidy's forehead rested against his, her breathing uneven. "So," she murmured, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Does this mean you're finally admitting you like this place?" Xavier let out a low chuckle. "I think I like something else a little more." Cassidy laughed softly, shaking her head before tugging him down for another kiss. And just like that, everything fell into place. Months later, the cafe was thriving. The weight of uncertainty had lifted, and Cassidy ran the place exactly how she always dreamed, with complete freedom. Xavier still found himself there every day, though now, he wasn't just a lingering customer. He was part of it, part of her life in a way he never expected to be. One evening, as she locked up for the night, she turned to find him waiting outside, his hands in his pockets, a rare look of uncertainty on his face. She frowned slightly. "Everything okay?" Instead of answering, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. Cassidy's breath caught. "I don't do things halfway," Xavier said quietly. "So when I realized I wanted forever with you, I knew I wasn't going to wait." Her hands trembled as he opened the box to reveal a stunning diamond ring, elegant and timeless, just like her. "I love you," he said, the words coming easily now. "And I don't want a single day without you in it, so Cassidy Nolan, will you marry me?" Tears pricked at her eyes, but a wide, radiant smile broke across her face. "Yes," she whispered. Xavier slid the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms, kissing her deeply under the glow of the city lights. And in that moment, with the cafe behind them and their future ahead, everything was exactly as it was meant to be.